So there was some discussion here, and hopefully some things you picked up off of the reading, is that it's still important to make our ERDs. It's still important to plan your database ahead of time, because there's still things that can get you if you don't have a plan, right? You can start adding data and just manipulating, modifying the data willy-nilly. You're probably going to find yourself doing a lot more work than if you created a diagram first. Does that make sense? So I didn't tell you for the group exercise to make a diagram, but you could have, and I think at least a few people did. But that's something that's being a good habit, right? It actually usually ends up saving you more time than it costs to make it. Okay? What else did I have here? Somebody asked about, hey, I asked you to do a bunch of the stuff in the shell, okay? But this video kind of mentioned using Compass and using Atlas a little bit more. What's the reason that I gave for asking you guys to do it in the shell?
To get experience writing the queries.
Writing the queries, writing the code, right? Because the code that you're writing in the shell is virtually identical to what we'll be writing in JavaScript. It's almost identical. There are some slight differences. For instance, projection is a little bit different, and the way that we actually deal with the asynchronous parts of this is a little bit different, because basically the shell is synchronous and where we write the code is going to be asynchronous. So there's some differences there, but it helps get you the fundamental language that you're going to need to write the JavaScript code. Okay? So that's part of why we're doing this. It helps explain. And it actually turns out that overall, most things are actually quicker on the shell. Most things are actually quicker on the shell than going through the GUI. The other side of things is you can get to the shell within VS Code. You can't really get to Compass. You have to pull up as a separate window. But the shell, you can just straight up do it in VS Code. You don't have to open up another window. You can just use a terminal window within that. So that becomes a lot quicker. I talked about, the lookup is basically like a left join. Aggregation pipelines are a really big deal. I haven't done a lecture over them yet specifically. I have some older slides from last year that I used, but it was mixed in with a bunch of other things. I thought I'd actually removed all the aggregation pipeline stuff off of this last lab, but didn't. So there was the one in there that was related to aggregation pipelines. We really do need to talk about it. My plan has been to talk about that later, is to cover that in a lecture later once we've started to get into the node side of things. So my plan is to talk about aggregation pipelines. I do need to make a lecture and give one about that specifically, but that will probably be a month from now, honestly, where that fits best. Okay? So we'll dive into that more because it's more important, but it fits at a later point in the course. Look up. Yeah, and one of the things I think, Dawn, here you'd mentioned, kind of this idea with indexes. If you have a few indexes on a small database, it's not a big deal. Or not having indexes, it's not a big deal. As your database gets larger, a lot of your little decisions, whether you have an index or don't have an index, how many collections you have, how you store things, becomes a lot more important. If you start with a very small database, a small amount of data, you can basically do anything and it'll work. But once you start scaling things up to millions of records, your decisions are much more important. Does that make sense? So one of the things that means is you really have to pay attention to some of those best practices and some of those guidelines, because when you go into the industry, you're going to find yourself very quickly dealing with large amounts of data, or bigger data than you will ever see in class. Okay, it's hard. It's hard to generate the amount. It's honestly hard for one person, for one student, to generate the amount of data that you need to really test and stress the performance. Okay. It's really hard for one person to make that much data. So you're probably not going to see the edge and the limits of what makes the difference in terms of performance, just to be honest, because our scope is small. Okay, so do pay attention to some of the best practices that are given out, things I talk about or things that are discussed in the reading material, because they're kind of preparing you for things to come. Okay, so those are things to watch out for. The data that you work with, generally the data you create, let's say you're working with this project and you only have, say, 100 products in your shop, you're not really going to see that.